Hello, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kathy Farrell. I am a registered nurse and have been in a specialty for gerontology for 20 plus years. I have a great interest in providing care for the elderly in the home, and I also experienced being a primary caregiver for my mom during the latter stages of her life with a chronic disease. So I have a great deal of experience in the area of gerontology, and I also have a great deal of practical experience with the application of gerontology in home care. My objective today is to look at 4 different areas which I believe are the important focus areas in caring for an elderly person. This person might be a parent, it might be a friend, it could very well be another relative, and for the most part the principles remain the same. Aging has become a topic that has become more and more important with longevity issues as well as issues related to aging in place and with aging in the home. The thing that is so important, I believe, is the desire and the will of the person that is engaged in the aging process. In all my experience with the elderly in home care, the thing that stands out the most for me is their need to be able to communicate what it is that they're experiencing. Some of this is complicated, and then some other areas are quite simplistic. But the idea is whoever you're looking after or caring for, they should certainly have an opportunity to be able to communicate what it is that they're experiencing. The 4 areas that I'd really like to look at, and these are topics or areas that have a great deal of content. For today, what I'd like to be able to do is to provide an overview of those areas. And it's in my professional opinion that these are the areas that carry the greatest emphasis. And those areas are physical, emotional, mental, as well as social areas. In the area of physical, what we look at and what is important is just the general health status of the individual. For example, if someone is aging healthy and there is an absence of chronic disease, the focus is more on maintenance for the individual and being able to provide as long as you can that maintenance so that they can age in place. The situation of physical issues become more complicated if there is chronic disease, and in several examples might be, for example, congestive heart failure or diabetes that has some complications. Emphysema is another example of chronic disease. And so if chronic disease is present, the issues become more complicated. For example, in chronic disease, there is often a higher occurrence of functional limitations. For example, in diabetes, if there is some issues with neuropathy, which affect the sensation and feeling in the feet, then I become more concerned with whether or not the individual can ambulate safely in their home. Can they feel their feet? Are they more subject to falls? Or are they more subject to burns or or injury. Another issue with chronic disease has to do with endurance. And so an individual might be able to ambulate safely in the home, but they have to go shorter distances and take more time to rest, so that their day is more restricted to less activity and more rest. So all these issues really come into play in looking at assessing and being able to evaluate what is the physical status of the individual. A physician certainly can evaluate those issues and counsel you with that. Nurses in home health, in my opinion, are the most experienced and are adequately trained to evaluate the physical status of an individual. Sometimes the other issues have to do with physical issues and just overall issues of nutrition and hydration. The elderly do lose some appetite stimulants. They feel that as time goes on, the taste diminishes, and certainly there may or may not be some issues with chewing because of dentures that are improperly fitted, or there may be some issues with swallowing and reflux disease. And so there are a lot of issues around nutrition, and it takes some time to evaluate the types of food that the individual likes and is able to eat. The second part to that is any kind of specialized diets that might be required based on pre-existing disease or chronic disease. Hydration is a big issue for the elderly. Many hospitalizations are directly related to dehydration, and it's not just in the summer months. Very often when you enter home in the winter, it's very warm and the heat is blasting because they're cold. And so what happens is that over time they tend to dehydrate even if it's in the winter months. What I tend to do is to identify for the individual an 8-ounce glass of water or any type of fluid that they prefer, and ask them to at least drink 4 or 5 of those a day. Typically the resistance is related to running to the bathroom as well, but they have to begin to learn to overcome that because hydration is important. The other piece that's really important with hydration has to do with medications. And sometimes the elderly can become more toxic on their medications if they begin to dehydrate. There is physiologically less of a stimulus for thirst in the aging population, so they have to relearn to be able to drink again. They're not necessarily cued by the nervous system that they're thirsty, so they have to kind of retrain themselves with respect to hydration. So I see nutrition and hydration as 2 big areas that family members or a caregiver can really focus on. Don't forget to check their weight. It's a very easy thing to do once a week. Weight gain or weight loss may or may not be easy to assess by just visually looking at the person. So, if you bring a scale over and really try to do a routine with a weight at least once a week, it's really important. Some patients with chronic disease, for example, with congestive heart failure, they're required to take their weights every day. So it's not uncommon for someone with chronic disease to do daily weights and to keep a record. Records are important. Even if you take a weight weekly and you look at water intake or how many days they've been injury free or things of that nature, and you could always bring those records to the physician's visit. Generally, the elderly visit the physician maybe once every 3 to 6 months. If they have chronic disease, they might visit more often. I was a clinical director for an inpatient geropsych unit, and that was a specialty unit which only focused on the mental health for the elderly, for patients over 65. And I really learned a lot there with respect to how painful emotional problems can be for the elderly. So I believe that the emotional aspect in the aging process is something that needs attention. It certainly needs discussion. It's more than just fussing about being old. It, in fact, can be a serious clinical depression. It can also be panic attacks and anxiety attacks. But in looking at emotional issues with the elderly, what I look at is the overall feeling of well-being and how well they are coping to their experience of aging. Um, the individual's experience is the single most important thing. It's how they're perceiving their experience that really is always the focus of my attention. I find that individuals who, if I understand more about their life history, if they have had tragedies in their lives, and who hasn't, then I always focus on what was beneficial to them. What did they do to cope? And how can they make that application today for what they're experiencing with the aging process? The areas that I find are the most common with respect to emotional well-being is whether or not the individual has a self-esteem, and whether or not those issues around self-esteem are being compromised. The other issue that I look for is the general tone of what is pleasant for them, and whether or not they're experiencing any pleasant experiences within the aging process. It's not just that grandma is grouchy or grumpy. Grandma might also be experiencing pain that's not adequately controlled, which can affect her well-being. So there is a lot of emotional issues. The single component that I have observed to be the most critical are issues of isolation and loneliness. And so those can certainly affect your mood. It can certainly affect your overall well-being. I have had many patients tell me that they don't feel a sense of worth now that they're old and getting ready to die. And so it's really important to be able to have conversations about their worth and the importance of their having a presence within the family and how much that can contribute to the family dynamic. And I always look for mood. It's more than how you're feeling today. It's more about just general observation as far as blueness. I also look at sleep patterns. Sleep patterns can tell you a lot about the mood of an individual. Although the elderly require less sleep, I always make an inquiry with respect to how much sleep are they actually getting. Do they nap during the day? Are they awake all night? And I always also talk to them about what they're afraid of. What makes them frightened? What What issues are they having that create concern, which create fear, which contribute to an overall mood and certainly contributes to anxiety. Keep in mind also that a lot of the elderly are also experiencing some financial constraints, and so the issues of finances can also affect the overall emotional well-being of the elderly. I think the thing that's most important with the emotional aspect is to keep a sense of humor. That even if there is some depression or blueness or down mood, it's kind of important to try to keep it light and to also not to discount it, but to keep it light so that you can introduce some humor. Everyone benefits when you can laugh a little bit and have a few chuckles. Sometimes have asked my patients in the past to keep a diary, to kind of jot down and write what it is they're worried about and what concerns them. I will tell you that many patients have told me that they wish that they could have honest conversations with their family members about what worries them, what they're afraid of, what their concerns are. So that's really an opportunity for a caregiver or a family member to have a conversation. It's difficult, but it's worthwhile. It does relieve a lot of anxiety. The emotional component of an elder is very much the same of the emotional component for other age groups. I think the thing that distinctly makes the difference is that the elder knows that for the most part they're toward the end of their life, and so there's a lot of life review that may or may not be pleasant for that individual. Nurses in the home and certainly social workers in the home can be a great asset and resource in trying to deal with emotional issues with the elderly. And again, I would encourage you to seek counsel from your physician as well. So we've talked about the physical, we've talked about the emotional. What I'd really also like to talk about now is the social issues. What I have experienced, I've spent a lot of years in home health, and so much of my focus is really on focusing on the environment that exists in the individual's home. What I have found is that the environment certainly can support an improved sense of well-being. Having familiar objects around are very important. Some objects, represent a whole lifetime of memories. And, it's part of the reason that sometimes Grandma is a little fussy about where we put things, whether or not they can reach them, for example, or whether or not they can view them, a certain picture or certain objects help them to recall memories of their lives, which are very important. The environment, as far as where they're living, are they on a one-level living environment so that there are not any stairs? And that's a great environment for someone who is functionally limited. Some would argue that it's better for Grandma to climb the stairs. She gets that exercise that she needs. I might argue that it's better to be in a building with elevators because if Grandma suddenly has a knee replacement, then how's she going to make it up those stairs? And so that just complicates the healing process with sometimes after surgeries. The other important thing about the environment is whether or not they feel safe in that environment. If they have begun to say they've lived in a neighborhood and they've been in that neighborhood for 60, 50 or 60 years, and suddenly that neighborhood isn't as safe as it used to be. So is the environment such that it's causing them some worry or concern? Is the environment clean? Are they able to keep it orderly? Is it a place where the lighting is good? You need to remember that very often with the elderly, they may begin to have some visual impairment, so that they may not see reflections or shadows as well, or maybe they see shadows that aren't quite there. So I think that the lighting is important so that they don't stumble or trip over things, chairs or cushions or pillows. The other thing is we are big in home health for removing scatter rugs. They tend to be a hazard and very often will lead to premature falls. Another aspect of social environments is whether or not an individual is living in a single family dwelling or whether or not they are part of a larger community, say for example a senior housing project, where there is congregation of people and they have so much in common with one another, so that they're able to engage in conversation and look forward to visits and maybe playing cards or social activities around dinners and or luncheons. Social activities are so important as far as engaging us in life's pleasures. They're also important in that it helps us to feel better about ourselves, that we still are a part of a community and we still have a contribution that we can make to that community. It's a little more difficult, I think, for an elder to be in a single family dwelling, because it tends to cause more isolation. However, I would add that if an individual was not a social being in their younger years, it's not likely that they're going to become one in their latter years. One of the things that I've noticed is that pets are very wholesome and renewing for the elders. If it's a small dog, as long as it's well mannered and it's not underfoot and becomes a fall hazard, or a cat, which is easy to care for. Many elders like birds, for example. It's easy to care for the cage. They provide song. They can very often have conversation, and there's still that human touch with respect to warmth and caring and love that's exchanged. So that might be a consideration. A word of caution with pets, puppies don't solve isolation. So if it's an individual who has had pets in the past, maybe it's a good idea. If it's someone who has never wanted a cat or never wanted a dog, then I would caution you against that. The other really interesting aspect of pets are aquariums. Swimming fish have a way of soothing us and kind of provide solace that we wouldn't otherwise have. So living things. The other thing that the elderly like a great deal are plants. A small plant like an African violet, which very often will bloom, seems to be a hobby or an activity that a lot of elderly women engage in. Um, the, I think there probably are differences between men and women who are aging with respect to their interests. We know that generally women outlive the men, and so we find a lot of single women in their home. That doesn't mean that there aren't also aging men who are lonely and isolated. I go back to what is the will and the desire of the individual and their experience for aging, and what are their interests. If you can focus on some interests, for example, I've noticed that some aging males like carving, and their vision is good. They like to do wood carving. They like to also tinker with respect to repairing things in the home or fixing things for other people. And so that's kind of like a social engaging activity that I've noticed happens on a regular basis. I think that if a male has been accustomed to um, caring for a home and making the repairs, and if their health is failing and they're no longer able to do that, that really becomes an issue for them. They view it as a loss. And so the idea is to try to reintroduce activities and skills that they are able to do. I mean, if their vision is somewhat impaired, then I mean, there's a whole host of activities that you can introduce, like talking books, talking tapes. A lot of those things are available free from the library. Um, the National Association for the Blind provides many, many, many resources that can provide stimulation without necessarily having a requirement to read. With technology available, certainly if um, DVDs and movies, especially old movies that kind of trigger a lot of memories, and certainly a lot of reminiscing is really important. Males tend to congregate in senior housing together. There is some mixing, but I think they kind of tend to talk about any experiences they may have had in their professional lives and or their military lives. That's a huge area of interest for men as well. But the principles are the same with respect to self-esteem as well as a general sense of well-being. The social aspects, in my opinion, are very important in the aging process. I think in the context of aging, a social model is really essential. I'd like to discuss some issues around the mental issues, and you might wonder, well, she talked about the emotional piece, why now are we going to look at the mental? I really believe that our mental process, our thoughts, trigger our emotional health. And so with all the discussion about dementia and memory loss, the mental status in the elderly is very important. There are some other factors which can impact memory. The single most important thing to remember is that there is some diminishing memory in the aging process. We know, for example, that after the age of 80, the incidence of dementia is much higher, and it continues to climb from 80s up over 100. Centurions are much more common today than they were 20 years ago. So we've had some time to really understand about memory and mental issues as well as memory losses. If grandma's just kind of forgetting things, I wouldn't panic too much. There is such a thing as benign forgetfulness, where we're stressed, we're under pressure, and suddenly we can't recall the name. We can't necessarily remember the person's last name or first name. But our mental status is really important for our overall health. The major issue I believe that the elderly struggle with is the whole process of aging, and where they're going to receive support for that and have a platform for discussion, or just an avenue in which that they can discuss again their fears and what they're afraid of, and will I be able to take care of myself? You know, are they going to put me away? Am I going to lose my sense of reliability because I can't quite remember? Our mental functioning in the elderly, for the most part, continues quite normally. However, over time, there are issues of um, decreased blood supply. There might be issues of loss of brain cells. Um, One area that is very much overlooked is pain management and the use of pain medications, and how that can affect mental functioning. Um, Cognition is the ability, to synthesize and be, and it has the processes of being able to respond appropriately to a situation and or a conversation. Very often what we see is that the elderly can remember things from a long distance back. That's long-term memory. Short-term memory is very often impaired. Um, the single most critical factor in memory loss is in the area of calculations. And that has a great impact with respect to um, being able to manage their finances, for example, where suddenly you realize that they've not been paying their bills. The electric company is calling and they're going to shut off the electricity because the bill hasn't been paid. And in calculating, it's very difficult to write a check, for example, and calculate the number. So I always look for calculations. There's several kind of tools that we use um, which help us to measure, for example, cognition and recall and calculations, and the ability to be able to identify objects, for example, like a watch or a pen. So there is a very mini kind of a mental appraisal that we can evaluate individuals and really establish whether or not there's any deficiencies that are beginning to surface with respect to mental abilities. Our mental abilities give us the skill to be able to function independently, and so when there begins to be some signs of mental deficiency, it really requires some attention. And there are physicians that can again provide an assessment. We now know that there are in-depth assessments with respect to memory and other areas of the mental function. I will say this, that the individual who is experiencing a decline in mental function is probably aware that that is occurring, and there is a tendency to hide it. There is a general factor of shame, and certainly a great deal of fear. And so in communicating with the individual, what you often find is that if you begin to direct questions in the area of their deficiencies, they tend to move the conversation in another area. So it takes some skill to be able to manage the interaction and the conversation. I will tell you that if those mental deficiencies are revealed, generally the person is relieved. They're relieved to have that deficiency out in the open, and it's as though there's a burden that's somehow relieved from them, which also improves their emotional status. I tend to think that very often when you look at the emotional health of an elderly person, if there have begun to become deficiencies in their mental area, it often is reflected on their emotional health. So I kind of see that as one kind of playing off the other. A big issue with respect to decline in mental status is the issue of driving. Some states have laws now where elders are retested for a driving exam. It is always very there's a great sense of loss if a driving license is removed from an individual and they can no longer be independent to kind of come and go at will. But the safety issue for them, as well as the safety of others, is the most important aspect. I mentioned earlier about pain medications. Pain medications can really kind of distort mental activity. It kind of slows mental thinking. It may cloud some judgment issues or judgment decisions. The other part with medication is that there are some medications which actually can cause deficiencies in mental functioning. So I think it's important, again, to visit with a physician and to certainly check out with a pharmacist the medications, making sure that the doses are correct, the frequency of the medication is taken as it's prescribed, and then also the issue of whether or not the individual is experiencing any side effects. It's fairly common in the home anyway for individuals to be taking anywhere from 5 to 10 medications. And so the interactions between those medications, the accuracy of the dose, the accuracy of the time plays a very important part in all of the issues that we've talked about. I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a working relationship with the pharmacist that is dispensing the medication. I realize that some medications are mail ordered, but there's still always someone that you can talk to with respect to the medications that are dispensed. It may not be the corner drug pharmacy store, but it could be a mail order place somewhere else, but a pharmacist is still available. So it's really important to make certain that you have a record of all the medications, that the medications are dispensed in the correct dose as they were prescribed, and that the dosing is provided accurately, either with a reminder system or if the individual is independent with their meds, that they're able to do that. Management of the whole medication system is really important for not only the physical, emotional, mental, but also social well-being. If an individual is over-medicated, they're not going to be engaged in social activities. They're too sleepy, they're too foggy. So those are things to really consider. And certainly a pharmacist can assist you in evaluating that. There's a lot to consider in all these four, what I call these four cornerstones in the aging process. But I do think that there are some warning signs that you should be aware of. And these warning signs would be a trigger for me as a nurse if I were evaluating an individual. It also is reassuring as caregiver if you're not necessarily seeing these warning signs that probably things are going well. Sometimes we as caregivers are overly concerned when there really shouldn't be any need for concern. And then other times there are obvious warning signs that are overlooked. So these are just some common warning signs that I would look for, and I make an inquiry about them when I see patients in the home. So the first one would be, for example, weight loss. Generally speaking, if there is a weight loss of more than 5 pounds in 30 days, it's a warning sign. Either nutritionally, they're not getting what they need, or they may be telling you they're eating and they're really not. Maybe they can't prepare their food. Maybe they don't have the energy to do it. Maybe they don't have the interest. It could be signs of, an undetected disease process. It could also be something as simple as just adding more calories or adding more protein in the diet. It may be that they're eating smaller portions. So weight loss, I look at weight loss as a big warning sign. That's why it's important to check the weight once a week, record it, and keep track of it. You can simply write it on a calendar, and you can keep adequate records that way. The second thing is falls. What I have found is that the elderly tend, if they have a fall, unless there is obvious bruising or injuries like a laceration or a skin tear or something of that nature, they tend not to tell anybody about it. They tend to keep it a secret. There's a lot of fear around falling. It may be an isolated event, but you need to have a conversation about it. I mean, obviously, if there's been a fall and there's a fractured hip and the individual is in the emergency room, that's obvious. But what about frequent falls without injury that are happening over and over again? So I always ask the individual whether or not they've had any falls. And they might say, yeah, I got up the other day. I got up too fast. I got dizzy and I fell down. Did you hurt yourself? Well, no. So falls is another warning sign. The other thing I look at is non-compliance for medications as a warning sign. Tells me a lot. It tells me whether or not they have the cognition, the interest, the judgment to be able to manage that. With the cost of medications, sometimes elderly individuals will stretch their medications. Maybe it's prescribed every day, but it's so expensive that they just take it every other day. So when you look at the bottle at the end of a week or the end of a month, if 30 tablets are dispensed and 30 days has gone by and there are still 15 tablets left in the bottle, something's not right. And that's usually the way we evaluate medications in the home. The other thing is if you're using a Mediset and there are days where the medicine wasn't taken, or there might be days where you notice pills are somewhat mixed up. The pink pill is supposed to be in every morning and suddenly they're all showing up in the evening slot. If there's any confusion around compliance with medications, the time that they're taking, the number of tablets, that to me is usually a warning sign. The other warning sign that I look for are around the issues of emotional warning signs. Withdrawal, that you can't, this is a person that you normally could engage in conversation and suddenly they don't want to talk, or you try to have a conversation with them and they're looking away. You try to make some humor and suddenly it's not funny to them, or there's a definite shift in mood. Something might be going on in their thought process or in their mental status that has become troubling for them. I always look at withdrawal as a warning sign. I also look at agitation or new anxiety as a warning sign. If suddenly, instead of being withdrawn, they're more um, agitated, they're more animated, they're more talkative. You notice kind of pressured speech where there's a lot of talking. And anxious, they're worried about, you can see there's a general anxiety, just an uneasiness, worry, more than a lot of worry and concern. I also look at that as a warning sign. Sometimes that's medication induced. Other times it might be some change in their emotional state, or it might be a physical state that is now presenting as anxiety. So I always look toward that. The other thing that I look for is clutter. It sounds so simple, but when an elderly person begins to lose function, they spend less time picking up after themselves. And what they do is they tend to have clutter. They have tables or coffee tables, and everything they need for the day is on that table. And it never moves. And as the week goes on, if I do a visit on Monday and suddenly Wednesday there's more clutter, in my mind something is taking place that's different. How are you sleeping? Let's get up and take a walk in the house. I'd like to walk with you and actually see if they can function. Are they still functioning at the same level as they were 2 days ago? Do they have any new bruising? Is there some issue about pain, for example, that's not being controlled? So I have a tendency to look at that as, for me anyway, in evaluating in the home, kind of a warning sign. So all of these things come into play, and they may or may not mean something, but very often they do. And that has been my experience for decades now in gerontology and caring for providing medical services in the home. I am pleased that there is a definite emphasis on the aging process. As an individual who is approaching aging in the near future, I am very pleased that there is a definite focus on health issues for the aging. I'm also very pleased that our culture is beginning to respect the value that elders bring to our culture, and the fact that elders can also contribute effectively as individuals within our culture. And so I think that the whole aging process is much brighter now than it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I'm pleased that is taking place. I'm also pleased that we're better informed, better educated, more knowledgeable, and certainly more willing to take action. It's not, it used to be, oh, that's just grandma and she's getting old. Well, that's not really that's not it. It's now we have better knowledge and better understanding, and certainly better scientific models to work with respect to aging. So we've discussed the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the social issues around aging. What I've given you is an overview which incorporates all my years of experience in gerontology. Many of these approaches may seem very simplistic, but my experience has been that these approaches are preventative in nature. If you can pick up non-compliance with medication and correct that, you can prevent a lot of problems. You can prevent a lot of injuries. Um, the beauty of all of this is that the aging process is a very natural thing. And with some adjustments in these areas and some interventions in these areas, it can enhance the experience for everyone. And so I would encourage you to think about these areas and to also look for these areas as ways of preventing as well as problem solving what your elder might be experiencing. And again, I go back to it is about the will and the experience of the individual. It's not what you think it should be, it's how they are experiencing this. And begin at that point. Begin at the point of physical issues and help them to organize it for themselves so that they can be free of unnecessary worry and anxiety themselves as well as yourself. So I thank you for this time. I hope that I find this beneficial, and I know that these areas are, from my experience, very beneficial in the aging process.